You disappeared for 6 hours the day of my mother's funeral, Declan. 6 hours. You said it was work. I never questioned it because I was busy burying my mother.
That was 3 years ago. Why are you bringing this up now?
Because I found the receipt.
The box had been in the spare room since the move. One of those cardboard boxes that gets labeled Declan Office and carried from one house to the next without ever being opened, because there is always something more urgent to unpack. Margot had opened it on a Tuesday afternoon looking for a phone charger. She found a work folder. Inside the folder, tucked between two printed spreadsheets from 2021, was a hotel receipt from the Kimpton Palladian in Seattle. Room service for 2. Check-in 2:47 p.m. Checkout 7:15 p.m. Date, the 14th of March, 2021. Her mother's funeral had been the 14th of March, 2021. She had buried Vivienne that morning. She remembered every detail of that day. The lilies, the gray sky, the way her knees hurt from kneeling on the church floor, the specific way Declan had held her hand during the service and said, "I've got you," before he kissed her forehead and said he had to step out for a work call that had gone complicated. Welcome to Breakup Diaries. This is the story of Margot and how she spent 3 years sleeping beside a man who had spent the afternoon of her mother's funeral in a hotel room with someone else. She is not crying when she tells this story. She is past crying. She is somewhere much quieter than that, and quieter is always worse. She did not confront him that night. She put the receipt back in the folder. She put the folder back in the box. She went downstairs and made dinner and sat across from Declan at the table they had bought together and watched him eat and talk about something that happened at work, and she thought, "How many other boxes haven't I opened?" That question, not the receipt, the question, was the thing that kept her awake until 4 in the morning. If you're just finding this story, welcome to Breakup Diaries. Last chapter, Margot found a hotel receipt in an unopened moving box. The receipt was dated the afternoon of her mother's funeral. Today we go back to that day, to what Margot remembered, and what she didn't know she was missing. The 14th of March 2021 started at 5:45 in the morning because Margot could not sleep. She lay in the dark beside Declan and thought about her mother, about Vivienne's hands, about the specific way she laughed, about whether she had said enough of the right things in the last year of her illness. Declan woke at 7 and made her tea without being asked. He was good that morning. She remembered that specifically. The service was at 11. He stood beside her the entire time, one hand at the small of her back or holding hers, present and solid in the specific way of a man who understood that his role that day was simply to be there. She had been grateful for that. She had thought, whatever else is complicated about us, he shows up when it matters. At 1:15, while family was gathered at her aunt's house after the service, his phone rang. He stepped outside. He came back in and said there was a situation at work, a client call that couldn't wait. He was sorry, he would be back by 7. She had nodded. She was tired and hollowed out and surrounded by family. She told him to go. She told him it was fine. He did not come back at 7. He came back at 8:30. He said the call had run long. She was so exhausted she did not ask any more questions. She fell asleep on the sofa with her shoes still on. He covered her with a blanket. That detail, the blanket, was the hardest thing to hold later. He covered her with a blanket. After spending the afternoon of her mother's funeral with someone else, he came home and covered her with a blanket. Drop your reaction below, because what Margot finds over the next 6 weeks is even more than the receipt. Subscribe and hit the bell. This story is only starting to reveal what it is. Margot was a project manager. She had spent 14 years organizing complex information into clear timelines. She understood instinctively that the receipt was one data point, and that one data point, however devastating, was not a complete picture. She needed the complete picture before she walked into any room with it. She spent 6 weeks building it. She started with the other unopened boxes. She found 2 more work folders from the same period, 2020 to 2022. She found receipts she recognized and receipts she didn't. She found a printed email thread she had to read 3 times before she understood what she was reading, not because it was explicit, but because it was tender in a way that required no explanation. The name at the top, Petra. She built a timeline on a spreadsheet she saved to a personal cloud account under a file name Declan would never search for. She added every receipt, every date, every gap in his schedule that she could now map against what she knew. She found that the overlap between Petra and the marriage was not a brief affair. It was 2 years. It had started 4 months before Vivienne was diagnosed. That detail rewrote everything, not just the funeral. The entire last 2 years of her mother's illness, the dinners where Declan seemed distracted, the weekends he worked late, the trip he canceled to a family event because of a conference, all of it re-indexed against the timeline she was building. She called Saoirse on a Thursday evening and said, "I need you to come over. Don't ask me questions on the phone." Saoirse arrived in 20 minutes with wine she didn't open, and the specific silence of a best friend who already knows the shape of what she is about to be asked to hold. Saoirse sat at the kitchen table and looked at the spreadsheet for a long time. Then she said, "How long have you known?" Margot said, "6 weeks." Saoirse looked up. "And you haven't said anything to him?" "Not yet." "Why not?" Margot was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Because once I do, it's over, and I wanted to understand it completely before I ended it. I didn't want to miss anything." Saoirse looked back at the spreadsheet. She said, "You haven't missed anything." Margot nodded. "I know." She chose a Sunday morning. No particular reason except that Sunday mornings in their house had always been quiet, and she wanted the confrontation to happen in a space that had once been ordinary. She printed the spreadsheet. She put it on the kitchen table beside his coffee. She sat down across from him and waited. He picked it up. He read the first page. He put it down. He said, "Where did you get this?" "From your boxes, the ones we've moved twice without opening." "Margot, how long?" He looked at the table. "It wasn't. 2 years is what the timeline shows. I'd like to know if that's accurate." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "It wasn't what you think." "The 14th of March 2021, she said. 2:47 p.m. to 7:15 p.m. The Kimpton Palladian, room service for 2. Her voice did not shake. She had been living with this information for 6 weeks. She had used all of her shaking up. "That was the afternoon of my mother's funeral, Declan." The kitchen was completely quiet. Outside, a Seattle Sunday morning, ordinary and indifferent. "I know," he said, very quietly. "You held my hand at the graveside?" She was not asking. "You said I've got you." "I know." "And then you left." He had nothing to say to that. There was nothing available to say. The 2 words "I know," said twice, quietly, without defense, were the most honest thing he had said to her in 2 years. They were also the end of everything. She stood up. She said, "I'll need you to be out by the end of the week." He left on the Thursday. He took 2 bags and said he would arrange for the rest of his things later. At the door, he stopped and turned and said, "I am sorry about your mother." She had been expecting many things from this conversation. She had not expected that. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You were always going to say that too late." She closed the door. She stood in the hallway of the house that was now only hers, and she waited to feel something. What arrived was not grief and not relief. It was the specific, enormous quiet of a woman who has been carrying something alone for 6 weeks and has finally put it down. The news moved through their social circle the way news always does, not in one announcement, but in the specific, branching physics of people telling one person who tells 2 people who tell the wider group until everyone knows and nobody is sure how. Margot told Saoirse. Saoirse told no one. Declan told his brother, who told his wife, who told the group chat. Within a week, Margot had received 14 messages. 3 of them were from people she had genuinely expected to side with Declan. They did not. One of those messages, from a woman named Harriet who had been Declan's friend before she was Margot's, said simply, "I suspected something for a long time, and I should have said something, and I didn't, and I am sorry." Margot read that message 4 times. She appreciated the honesty. She also felt, for the first time since opening the box, something approaching rage. Not at Harriet. At the specific architecture of a situation in which multiple people had felt something and said nothing while she grieved her mother beside a man who had spent the afternoon of the funeral in a hotel room. She said as much to Saoirse, loudly, using language she did not normally use. Saoirse sat on the other end of the sofa and let her go until she ran out of words. When Margot finally went quiet, Saoirse said, "Better out than in." It was the right thing to say. It was almost funny. Margot laughed for the first time in 6 weeks. It was a short laugh, and it was not entirely joyful, but it was real, and it was hers, and that was enough for one evening. Declan made one attempt to explain himself, a long message she received 3 weeks after he left, on a Wednesday evening, which she read once, replied to with 2 words, "No thank you, and never read again." She did not block him. Blocking felt like energy she preferred to spend elsewhere. She just did not read anything else he sent. She found that this was enough. Sometimes enough is the only thing that needs to be enough. The hardest part, Margot told Saoirse in the months that followed, was not the marriage. The marriage had been over, she understood now, long before the box. The hardest part was untangling the grief for her mother from the grief for the marriage, because they had been fused together for 3 years without her knowing it. Every memory of Vivienne's last months was contaminated by the knowledge of what Declan had been doing during them. The hospital visits she had made alone because he was working. The phone calls she had taken in the kitchen while he watched television. The way she had felt lonely inside her marriage during the hardest period of her life, and told herself it was just the weight of grief and not something worse. It had been both. She had been right about the grief. She had also been right to feel lonely. She just hadn't had all the information yet. She started going to her mother's grave more often after the divorce. Not to cry, she had done most of the crying alone in the 6 weeks before the confrontation, when nobody was watching. She went to sit, to be near Vivienne without anyone else's presence complicating it. To talk, sometimes, in the specific private way that people talk to the dead when nobody is within earshot. She told her mother what had happened. She told her she was sorry she hadn't known on the day. She told her that the afternoon of the funeral, despite everything, had still been a good goodbye. That the lilies were right. That the sky was the specific gray that Vivienne had always liked. That Margot had been there, fully, completely, even if the man beside her hadn't been. Before you go, the question I cannot answer cleanly, and neither can you. When Declan said, "I am sorry about your mother," at the door, was that the one honest moment he offered her? Or was it the final act of a man who always knew how to perform exactly the right thing at exactly the wrong time? Drop your answer below. And if this story touched something you've been carrying about grief, about the people who were supposed to hold you through it, about what you find in unopened boxes years later, this comment section is yours. This is Breakup Diaries. See you in the next one.